Minding the Darkness is part of a trilogy that I began it 20 years ago with a poem called Coming to Jakarta, a poem about terror, which I wrote my way out of a near nervous breakdown after a book that I had finished and got in on time, was supposed to come out in first printing of 250,000 copies was suddenly stopped by its publisher. And I went to see Noam Chomsky, and I said, I've just had a publisher kill my book. And he said, that's funny, I just had my publisher do the same thing. That was 1980, the year that Reagan was elected. And I had a bit of a nervous breakdown, and I won't go into the details, but when I got out of it, I had written this poem very quickly. And then I showed it to my mother, and she was very upset by some of the painful things I'd written about my childhood. And she said, but you know, you were also a happy child. And then I saw what I had to do. I dedicated this mean, nasty poem to my father, who was still alive and didn't mind. And then I wrote a poem about the good things in life and dedicated it to my mother. This is the one that's for sale. And maybe as a way of plugging the book, I may read a bit from it in the middle, but we're mostly here tonight to hear about this poem, Minding the Darkness. Now, the subtitle of this poem is a poem for the year 2000, and by speeding up, I got it finished in just about exactly 10 years, and it did actually come out in the year 2000. And I'm very touched that the first substantive review of this poem, which was supposed to have been out today in Cody's books in the poetry. How many of you know the Poetry Flash? It's a magazine. And do they distribute it up here? Yes. Good. Well, the next issue is supposed to have on the front page quite a long review of this poem by a friend, David Shattuck, who I met through Denise Levertov. And he pointed out something that I hadn't really seen myself. He said this poem is like a prophecy of the events of 9/11. Well, how could that be? I wrote it in the year 2000. Well, let me tell you that it really took off in response to the Great Fire in Berkeley, Oakland, 1991. When my wife Rana and I were burned out. And the first two sections, which I'm about to read to you, are about that fire. And then at the end of the second section, I'm beginning to realize that what separates America from the rest of the world is that it's so unusual for us to have everything go up in flames. And it's such a frequent. I mean, I was in Poland for 2 years as a Canadian diplomat, and Warsaw, for example, was 94% destroyed in World War II. And that is more perhaps the typical experience of the world than our protection. And having that brief fire, I had sort of broken through into a different kind of experience. Well, having mentioned my wife, Rana, who's here, and if you want to meet her, all you have to do is buy one of my books because she's selling them. I do want to read from just the first printed page in the book. It says, I want the world to know that this poem is, in its inception as in its end, a love poem to my wife, Rana Kavatsnik. So that the first poem, dedicated to my father, mean and nasty, and the second poem, dedicated to my mother, about the good things, and now a third poem, trying to pull it all together, which is dedicated to my wife. And she and I, she's very much in this first section because, as I say, it's about our experience of the fire. And I think I'll just start reading now. When I put up my fingers like this, I'm quoting. And usually I'm quoting somebody else, but every now and then I'm just quoting a thought that came into my mind that is not really by me, it's just a thought. That's this one. If you want to change your life, burn down your house. Before we left for the beach, Rana took off her rings, placing them on the basin to be safe like her other possessions. The hot offshore winds meant it was warm and cool as we waded on the wet sand through the agitated air. A day that was just right. Rana rehearsing her solemn procession toward me, one arm crooked up on her imaginary father's, the other with an imaginary bouquet, surrounded by frisbees. A day happy enough to forgive one's karma, forget that of others, under a blue sky, which, as we returned over the Devil's Slide, was divided like a flag, half blue, half ominous black. The dense smoke a message to speed home over the Bay Bridge to the miles-wide storm cloud, increasing in darkness, fringed with dots of flame until it was almost night. Headlights, the sudden emergency warning our freeway was closed towards the house where, we did not yet know this, Cherry, our unsuspecting housemate from Taiwan, had just narrowly escaped through a burning rain of eucalyptus leaves with no more than her stuffed bear. And a few yards up the street, 8 people burned to death, rivulets of metal from their melted cars over the burned asphalt. We were the last to make it through, we heard from one survivor who had jumped in the back of a stranger's pickup in the hushed exchanges as we waited for coffee next morning at the bed and breakfast, with nothing to do that day but to tell our tales. The woman 2 doors down had loaded her car to the roof, and now it was too late to go back inside and find her car keys. Tales that were fragments. The 4th afternoon, we were taken there in an Oakland police car, a wreath where our neighbor died, and the thick layer of ash. Could this be all our books? The stove, the refrigerator, the 2 sets of china? As unpossessed as the Huron potsherds in the black corner of that autumn field, the burnt tiles of that Roman villa, impossible to explain this for a world not fully mindful that we all must die. In a bravura gesture of letting go, Rana took out her key and threw it back to the divas. We were taken away, the 3 of us, crying like ancient warriors or pre-adolescents. Dry sobs that since have come back in therapy. Divorce, my mother's death, choked us that week at each glimpse of the naked hillside, as labile as children who have not yet the illusion we are in control. Dazzled and shattered in turn by the ominous beauty of, say, a sunset under rain clouds, from which it was a relief to go back to teaching. Pound's tears at Pisa, watching the spider at work, the tent pegs moving shadow, the moon through laundry. To the 9 through 5-ness of a 20th century, the unquestioned defense of a self as if in 1 week we had lived 2 different ages, 2 habits of living. The comfort of culture, more easily destroyed than preserved, versus Dasein face to face with its original nakedness. The 2 irreconcilable, except when caught off guard, my cheek unexpectedly wet from reading in the Chronicle of Tibetan prayer flags flapping from the remains of trees. Now, I wrote most of that right after the fire in 1991, but at the end you heard a little bit of philosophy creeping in, Dasein, etc. I had already described these 2 different states that we'd been in, the one where we were just totally undone by the experience, and then the normal experience where we think we're in control and you all expect to drive home tonight, you don't expect to have your car and a house in flames when you get back there. That's the second kind. It was very near the end of writing this poem, which did take almost 10 years, that I realized that that's what Heidegger writes about in his philosophy. He had been through World War I, so I guess he had had some experience of this. So all I had to do was stick in 2 extra stanzas, define the 2 states of mind in terms of Heidegger, but it was from my own experience originally. And I'm going to read a part from the next poem, which is also about the fire. I'm not going to read all of it. But at the end, I come to realize, as I think I've already said, that what seemed so earth-shattering and unique and unprecedented for me was in fact almost a way of joining the human condition as it is normally lived. So I think about other cities that burned, beginning with Washington and Atlanta, and I don't want to give you all the dates, but all the other cities that burned around the first millennium and were narrated at the time by various monkish observers as saying, aha, the end of the world. And what's really interesting to me and why I wanted to bring it in, because the one I quote from blames it all on covetousness. It's a word we can hardly use in English, but it's actually a word that moralists have always been talking about. And I would have to say that if this country is really in trouble, it's because there still is too much covetousness around. And one of the things that this poem tries to do is to bring the consciousness of the writer and hopefully the reader into the state of mind of those people who have seen their cultures, whether it's Virgil or Dante or whoever, from the point of view that something is profoundly wrong because there is too much of this awkward word, covetousness. So when you hear it at the end, it's the translation of a monk called Rodolphus Glaber writing around the year 1000, sincerely believing that all these cities burning proves that the world is coming to an end, which is why this is a poem for the year 2000. So as I say, I'm only going to read part of this. I pick up in the middle. We who live in cities like to talk of nature and ecological balance, of deeper patterns than what we see, miraculous stories, usually from far off, of a ferry going down in flames, a dolphin rescuing a survivor. We want to believe them when we see the TV news, Serbs shelling Dubrovnik, dozens of buildings destroyed. This was happening exactly at the same time as the fire, and then I suddenly realized, hey, dozens of buildings. We had 3,300 buildings. That's more than Dubrovnik. Scenes which 1 week ago revived the survivor's guilt I have carried since World War II, that humanity is the problem, that this century's disasters, anticipated by Nietzsche, a convulsion of earthquakes, wars the likes of which have never been seen on earth, followed not from weakness of the will, that was Nietzsche's analysis, but from its opposite, willful disruption for sake of profit of small-scale ecosystems. We thought 4 years of drought, last year's heavy frost, the dead hillside eucalyptus, were all somehow unnatural, that with a native cover of redwood and live oak, we might have been spared the fire, the ash which has killed the fish in Lake Temesco, from my books, my car, from 3,300 homes, many more than Dubrovnik. Barely a soupçon of what happens in modern wars, and yet enough to give us what most Americans have forgotten, a taste of what it was like to endure the burning of Washington or Atlanta, or, as 10 years later, my mind restored by distance to its usual thinking, secure in denial, can read of the first millenniums, earthquakes followed by fires, when London and Oxford burned, Hamburg and Cordoba in 1 hour laid waste, inspiring a monk. Now this monk quotes from the book of Revelation, which is worth reading actually, chapter 18. Alas, the great city, because he's talking about Babylon burning. To warn of perilous times, covetousness stalks abroad, the whole human race sliding into the gulf of primeval chaos. Having seen annihilation, can one believe again in Wordsworthian ministries? Odd how much time there is. Now my car has melted. I have less control of my life, and my life less over me. I don't keep up as much as I used to. Even these chickadees, I've been feeding chickadees at the beginning. Even these chickadees are too nervous for me. There is no answer here. A quick flutter in the stream, and they are gone. I'm not going to talk much more about covetousness, but I'll just jump ahead to a bit in the middle of the poem where I revive this awkward word, because Dante also used, at least in the English translation, cupidigia. So I quote a bit from, even up in the top of paradise, Dante, you'd think he's got his mind pretty well cleansed out from all his earthly anger, but no, way up at the top of Paradiso, he looks down on earth and he says, covetousness. And I'm going to just read about some 12 lines of this, quoting, of course. Covetousness, in which we are so immersed that no one has the power to turn his eyes away, as Dante heard in heaven after he had last looked down at the mad track of Ulysses. But the repetition of such warnings, no disaster worse than greed, that's the Tao Te Ching. See, everybody says the same thing if they've thought about it, is now so anachronistic it proves the extent to which our left and right, the nation, the National Review, have receded from Jefferson's goal of, and this is a quote from Jefferson, silently lessening the inequality of property. And I don't know if I'll get back to this or not, but the middle of the poem is simultaneously a condemnation of where we are now in this country and praise of some of the things that the Founding Fathers wanted for it. Not everybody on the left talks this way. It's frequently fashionable to say it all went wrong with this aristocratic elite who preserved their property rights by staging a revolution and so on. I don't agree. I think that something very profoundly important happened for the world with the American Revolution. And the very fact that it was so precious meant that it wasn't going to last in its pure form for very long, which is what this middle section is about. But we'll come back to that. And how am I doing here on time? I'd like now, I in a sense recapitulate the dialectics of the two first books. Let me just read the little statement I have at the end, and this may, it was quoted in the review as one of the ways in which I was addressing the issues of 9/11. I'm just going to jump to the very end of it and say how I'm trying to include in this volume the sort of yang intellectual movement of the first book and the yin compassionate movement of the second book, which is dedicated, as I said, to my mother. Minding the Darkness contains a yang followed by a yin movement, although these are presented like day and night, each arising out of and evolving into the other. My father was also a poet, and my mother was known as an intellectual painter. In this way, Minding the Darkness has emerged as an effort to reconcile the movements of secular or historical enlightenment and of spiritual or personal enlightenment that are represented by the first two volumes. It attempts to comprehend the deep antinomies that have characterized our culture: Apollo and Dionysus, Greek and Hebrew, Platonism and empiricism, classical and romantic, intellect and love. Like other long poems by older men, it toys dangerously with abstract didactic impulses. At the end, it suggests with Shelley that both outer enlightenment, the current word is development, and inner enlightenment are damned, even murderous, if they do not honor each other. And the way I see what's happening in the world right now between the fundamentalists of Islam and the fundamentalists of our own country is a lot of it can be reduced to this sort of mutual incomprehension of people who believe in making the world better externally and the people who focus on making the world better internally. And my belief is that we should work to do both at the same time. Now, my father and my mother exemplify for me these two tendencies, yang and yin. And so I'll read first about my father from the yang section, not all of it, because a lot of it's about Canada, but I'll read some of it. He was a constitutional lawyer. He helped found the Canadian Socialist Party, the CCF, which is still going. It's a different name. But I'll just read here and there in it and hope that it makes sense to you. As an only child whose father was often absent, I studied his ways, not just on fishing trips, when, from the back of the canoe, he showed how to twist the paddle silently in the water so as not to scare the loon, or when at Lachute, how to make the boomerang float back through the air to drop at our feet. I remember his netted sling. I thought of him as David when the round pebbles sailed far over the cedars. At that time, I knew little of my father's ideals, drawn from moral critiques of the acquisitive society, or, after he came to believe the orthodox was wrong, his more practical proposals for politics, the only road to heaven now, having learnt from H.G. Wells that misery could be replaced by imagination and large-scale planning. It must have been Frank who showed how to rock a rotting tree trunk slowly forwards and backwards, finding and feeding the rhythm that would finally bring it down in a chaos of broken branches. And the first time I did it on my own, in front of 3 young girls, as the pine began to fall, there leapt out from a hole near the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a whole family of flying squirrels. As I looked in the feral eyes of the middle sister, I saw myself as demiurge, and believed for a moment with Goethe that to discover the mysteries of nature, one must violate them. Was there something in our line that was tempted by decay to bring it crashing down? When, after Kent State and Nixon's invasion of Cambodia, I moved the faculty amendment to suspend all campus teaching and the governor responded in rage, did I pause even for a second to ask, what have we wrought? And though by acting out that particular drama, I still believe we avoided the violence that divided teachers from students at Harvard and Columbia, I have finally seen this moment why Miłosz, remembering the gangs of Central Europe, turned his back on me then. And I will skip. I remember my father's sling. It was just before she died, my mother told me how police had come to the door of St. Matthew's Rectory in the upper town of Quebec to show my grandfather, the archdeacon, the stone that had broken a window in the French-speaking lower town. How it may be fate and not merely character that makes an Apollonian defense of the law turn to extra-legal power, while my father, a rugged and sensitive man, beloved by many, though usually from outside, with a mind sometimes benign, or else volcanic with frustration from his failure to build the Blakean commonwealth of the Anglican hymnal, I will not cease from mental strife till we have built Jerusalem. A poet with his own voice, and in the end that older voice, speaking in Wordsworth's dream of apocalyptic deluge, approached his death, struggling with almost prophetic forces inside of him, never to be fulfilled. Now, each of these sections has, my wife and I were meditators and we go on retreats from time to time, and the big sections are interrupted by retreat sections which sort of pull away from time and politics and history. And in the middle of the first retreat section, comes at the end of this Yang section, I have this memory of my father. It's a more positive memory, so I read this as a kind of coda to what I just read. The mindfulness of fire tending. I was the fire tender for the retreat. It was a very cold winter, a very important position to keep the logs on the fire, not too warm, not too cold. The mindfulness of fire tending taught me by my father the importance of not resorting to paper. How in a rainstorm to split soft wood with an axe and kindle with splinters from the tree's core, or with a penknife to whittle dead twigs for their inner shavings. How birch bark will burn when wet. The secret inner heart of that public man. And now I will read a poem about my mother. Not all of it. She was a painter. And also, she just said last year, 2 years ago now, it's still going, 7 years after she died, they organized a retrospective show of her paintings, which is going across Canada. And they brought out a beautiful book using material from her notebooks, which I was never able to see. And it confirms, well, actually I started writing this before I knew about the notebooks, but I was able to add them in because it confirmed what I remembered, my mother's interest in Nietzsche, who was a little far out from my father. My father was more interested in people like Bertrand Russell and, sensible Anglo-type philosophers, none of this German wildness. There's a bit of Nietzsche comes in the poem, you'll hear it. In my mother's studio, I was not allowed to enter, even when I was 64 and she bedridden. The easel still stood, crusted with paint, and still breathing, it seemed to me, the smells of turpentine, shellac, although after the war she had shifted over from oil to acrylic. An impasto thicker than Jackson Pollock's flecking even the walls and floor. When we sold off the house, there being no money to make it a museum, a jolt to my earlier assurance that her art would endure, my mother, when 11, had been part of the spring exhibition at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and thereafter pursued with attention my father and I never mustered the one thing needful. Though she never finished high school, one of my father's tics was to point fun at her spelling. He loved this one. Please knock, N-O-C-K. So what? She misspelled the word knock. She loved George Eliot and liked to quote Nietzsche, "Live dangerously, count every day lost that you have not danced," as well as Goethe, "Not a circle, a spiral." Despite her interest in pure patterns from science, atom, bone, and embryo, she seemed a little removed from the external world. It was by general agreement that she gave up driving. And on her one fishing trip, her first and only trout, still wriggling vigorously, landed inside her blouse. But the more she receded from the details of this world, the more she saw it whole. And my father generously admitted that of the two, she seemed more serious about life. Above all, about inner life. It was she who embarrassed me mornings. "Did you have any dreams?" Taught me to see the beating wings of the yellow swallowtail in the purple lantanas. Later, I came to honor her search for a uniqueness, leaving no space for enemies. Her strength to respond to news of setback or betrayal, not with personal recrimination, but with rededication to her art, which left her less and less interest in the distractions of mere fame. When we cleaned out the house, I gave the easel, along with the tall cupboards, to my cousin and godson Peter Colley and his wife Stephanie, the painter. Now they have moved to Australia. Nothing is promised to endure. Not even this red sky she painted in the months after my father died, with two blue orbs and a broad volcanic flow of pigment, any more than this photo taken when my mother was 82 by the next door neighbor, a Jewish woman who emigrated from North Africa in the 60s. The first neighbor in 40 years who knew my mother at all. It sits 4 feet away on my desk and catches my mother's face, but not her eyes, still looking behind me. And again, I think I am going to skip the whole middle section. By the way, if you've seen can you see the cover of the poem from where you are? It's here, and if you're way in the back, all you have to do is pull out your billfold or your purse, take out a $1 bill, and the central sections of the poem are about the mysterious pyramid and eye and quotation on the $1 bill. I'm not going to have time to read it to you tonight, but you see the words below, Novus Ordo Seclorum. It's on every dollar bill. And when I go to places like Dallas, I know that there are a lot of right-wingers. I saw a book, it was a cover very much like mine, not quite as beautiful, I must say, but it had the pyramid and the eye and Novus Ordo Seclorum, and then you open the page and it said in very big letters, Novus Ordo Seclorum equals New World Order. And they see the conspiracy of Bush and the trilateralists as something going back to the Illuminati and something from the right. I was talking about the left earlier, but the right also feeling that something got foisted on America. I think it was extremely inspired, but also almost prophetic of the founding fathers to create a great seal that quotes from Virgil's fourth eclogue. How does it, when I get nervous in public, it's safer for me to read than to try and quote. Magnus ab integro cyclorum nascitur ordo, and now a great order is born, a great order of the centuries is born. And I think that they were reading it very optimistically to say that, and in fact this is a correct gloss, that Virgil is alluding to the notion of the 4 ages, and that we've now come to the worst age, which is the age of iron, but out of this will come a return to first times the age of gold. And that was a very optimistic prophecy to be taken up by the founding fathers. But, you know, in the 21st century, we've learned to read things in much more complicated ways. And I taught Virgil, and I liked to point out that Virgil was writing at a time when the Roman Republic, the city-state, was threatened and, in fact, about to be destroyed by its success, by the twin forces of militarism and globalism. And Virgil, writing about this, not totally thrilled with this. And he made his poem, it's, you know, if you read about it in one sentence, it's supposed to be a praise of empire, but it's very much a warning to empire not to make the mistakes of previous empires and succumb to what he called auri sacra fames, cursed hunger for gold, and which was the fault of Troy, which went up in flames. And of course, I think we would say in retrospect that the Roman Empire failed to heed that warning, and it lasted a long time, but in the end, down it went. I do want to close, and remember I said at the very beginning, this was in the beginning and its end, a love poem to my wife, Rana. And I would love to have read 2 of these, but I've taken too long. I'll just read the second one, which comes actually in the midst of this love poem, comes back to the theme of the West and its external enlightenment versus Islam and its emphasis on spiritual correctness. It begins with a dream, and it ends with what caused the dream. I've given it away. You're not supposed to know it's a dream. Pretend you didn't hear me say it's a dream. Having reached the too narrow balcony, and I have to explain also that I got a grant to finish this poem at the Villa Cerboloni in Italy. And I was very lucky because the 2 first books each have a lake in them. And I had almost finished this poem and there was no lake, but then I got this grant, and there was this huge, beautiful lake that was also a symbolic lake, symbolic for Wordsworth as well as for me because of the amount of history about it. So I had the lake of culture, of, shall we say, affluence is the first lake, and the second lake, the lake of nature, which was my mother's father's lake, and now this third lake, which I shared with Rana. So you have to know that that's the context. We're looking out of the villa at the lake. Having reached the too narrow balcony up the perilous fire escape, I stand up naked, my heart clutched with the great height, and I say to the woman who brought me here as part of the experiment, it is discomforting to have learned they have found DNA on Mars. It's too much for my mental world. At this point, my dark glasses fall down 9 stories to the earth. I call out to the stranger, those are mine, and having thus dangerously exposed my nakedness, I wake up. And now I will skip a great deal about the entire world and come to the end of this section, which will end with my wife, Rana. I say I come to plain words in prose, which can be taken as a gift, though God knows I and the reader have worked hard to reach this place. Subjectivity, the dialogue between the thalamus and cortex, the neurons replying to the senses, I dream, therefore I am. So that inner and outer enlightenment depend on each other, both of them lost when they are not dialogical, and impious Greek arts are pitched against blind, superstitious Trojan furor. This is an allusion to the Aeneid, for those of you who know it. This is what is wrong with secular capitalism and its mimetic offspring, secular communism, facing the theocratic alternative of Sharia and jihad, proposed to Edward Said at Cairo University by a well-spoken woman whose head was covered by a veil. I have written what I have seen for this unextraordinary millennium, like every other year, an end and a beginning, between the cosmic cycles of din, judgment, and of chesed, loving kindness, a kind of golden age. Yang, comprehension, the strength not just to understand, but to change the world. The fault of enlightenment, like that of religion before it, was that it changed not so much, but so little of our still mysterious world, tempered by yin, compassion, toward the open. The Rebbe, these words shall be on your heart, and when your heart is broken, they will fall in. The poetry of that lake was in the ruins, from Theodolinda's castle to the empty walls of households, rubble from so many failed dreams that it is less a pain than an entry into fellowship to contemplate our own. And when Rana and I danced, naked in the middle of the night on the moonlit balcony, overlooking the lake, more dreamlike even than the dream, I felt like crying. May everyone experience such breathing moments, this now already gone. Yes?
There was a line in there that it was one of your quotes, and I believed it had to do with belief and unbelief being one and the same.
Yes?
Could you elaborate on that a tad?
Well, I was quoting, and I have to,
Yes,
I think that was Meister Eckhart.
Yeah.
And the general, what I'm generally depicting in this section is that whereas when religions get into ritual, they get further and further apart, but every religion then reads a reaction in the direction of either Sufism or Kabbalah or various forms of esoteric religion, and that these become less and less distinct. And in fact, the poet Rumi, who is the great Sufi poet, born actually in Afghanistan, in Herat, which was and still is a great city for Sufis. He says in his poetry that his religion is the religion of Jesus. And also his name, Rumi really means Roman. Rome by his era meant Byzantium, but he moved to Turkey, and Turkey was so close to Istanbul that he got the name. So in many ways he exemplifies the kind of universalistic aspect of Islam, which exists in every religion, and Meister Eckhart exemplifies that also. I don't know if I have an actual, I may only quote a secondary source here for that thing, but if you're interested in where to find it, we can come up afterwards and look for it. Any other questions? Yes?
I have two specific questions that I'm trying to understand the situation. One is, why are we giving aid to Saudi Arabia? Why are we giving money to them? And the other question is, are we really trying to feed those people in Afghanistan? Because to me, if we can have laser-guided missiles that hit these jackpots and only lose one life in all this devastation, how is it that we cannot airlift food and medical supplies for these people?
There's aid for training. There's some specifically targeted things. But we buy oil, and then we also sell them a lot of armaments. And that's one of the things that balances the budgets between the two countries. And in the first phase, they were extraordinarily rich and brought back something like $100 billion into this country, most of it backing people like James Baker and the Bush family. We never really finished the story of the Bushes and the Bin Ladens. Some of you know about the, help me, what's the group? The Carlyle Group. The Carlyle Group. The Bin Ladens tactfully withdrew from it after 9/11, but a lot of Bin Laden money put together this defense conglomerate which employs James Baker and employs George Bush Sr. and even George Bush Jr. has had a bit of money from them in the past. What?
Frank Carlucci.
Yes, Frank Carlucci, that's right. It's you know, I studied very closely the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was a big scandal of 10 years ago, a Muslim bank that was laundering drug money and so on. And the money went to every politician of both parties, and most conspicuously Jimmy Carter. It's hard to find, frankly, a politician who's not touched by this.
In your experience overall, and to this point with your wisdom from your experience, are we in fact living in a plutocracy, or are we living in an illusionary democracy? And what does that mean in terms of, I'm almost 60, I'm going to live to be 100, so in the next 40 years, what do you think that means?
Well, in 40 years, we'll have a drink about it. And I think it's certainly not an abuse of language to say that we're living now in a plutocracy. But I don't think it really helps to, you know, just get hung up on the names and say, are we democracy or are we a plutocracy? There are elements of both and have been probably from at least what my friend Charlie Sellers calls the market revolution in the first half of the 19th century. And certainly since the Civil War, there's been heavy plutocracy in this country. What are alarming to me are the dynamics, because, and this is where the analogy of Rome comes here, that we have a constitution that it's not perfect, but it's, as constitutions go, works quite well for a federal republic. It didn't imagine having a capital city, Washington, that was controlling most of the world. And this is what happened to Rome, too. It had these armies marching around. There was nothing in the Roman constitution about these armies. The armies eventually came back and took over Rome as well. And nothing really changed, you know. I mean, they went on having elections. They went on having senates and consuls and, you know, just like we go on having elections and so on. But most of us concede that something has changed, that the defense budget since World War II has become untouchable. And I understand that the black budget for the CIA quadrupled in the 1990s, and most of us don't even know it. Wasn't, I think, even in the papers. And so I'm not even sure it's true. But when most of the really important things are happening, by the way, I have to come back to my poem on this, because I'm saying that the two really important institutions in this country are the CIA on the one hand and the Federal Reserve on the other, and not even Congress knows what's going on in there. They speak to each other directly, saving the dollar here and so on. But not only is the American people left out, but Congress doesn't have very much to say about it either. And as the dollar has now become a global currency. So, you know, in other countries, we have all these euro dollars that float around outside the United States. So that instead of just saying it's a plutocracy, I would say that these global forces have shrunk the relevance of our political institutions to what's really going on. And that's why presidents seem more and more impatient about they have to go and talk to Congress at all, because Congress represents the 50 states, but they're thinking about, doing all these deals in Central Asia and getting oil out of Kazakhstan. I mean, all of this is way beyond what Congress was set up for. I'm going to move it around a bit. Yes? Either of you. Yes?
What do you, related to what you just said, what, as a person that perhaps has thought about this, what do you feel that the Constitution says that is relevant to the CIA and the Federal Reserve, and for that matter, the IRS?
I don't think the Constitution says anything.
I mean, therefore...
You know where the CIA comes from? It comes from the National Security Act of 1947, which essentially was trying to merge the armed forces, and then it said, we'll set up a National Security Council. That's a fine thing. And they said, well, the National Security Council should be able to get its own intelligence, shouldn't have to rely on Army intelligence, naval intelligence. Fine. So they can get intelligence from this new organization, the CIA. And then stuck in the statute, the CIA shall also perform such other duties as the president shall from time to time direct. Well, that's the statutory basis for overthrowing governments and creating counterfeit currencies of other powers and just generally pushing the third world around till it's blue, black and blue. And even Truman, who signed the act, said, I don't know how sincerely, he said, when I created the CIA, I never had any idea it was going to get into all these kinds of covert operations. So there is no constitutional basis for it. And in the public record...
Only the executive power to sign such declaration?
Well, this was an act, the National Security Act. But the idea of laws is that they define what things are going to do, and this was explicitly a little passage that had no definition to it at all, could justify anything. And they do say that there was a secret statute passed at the same time. I don't know, but we've never seen it, and I don't even think we've seen convincing proof that it existed. There was another question here.
Yeah, I have a question about the...
I'm sorry, but the Federal Reserve is the same thing. It was a statute from the beginning of this century. And there I have some sympathy. There is a terrible problem how to regulate a currency. If it's completely democratic, then you get something like Argentina, where you keep printing money to make everybody happy, and you get 5,000% interest. I don't think we have a good system, but I think we have a better system than the Argentinian one. So it's difficult.
Did you get any inside information on the Israeli airplane that was bombed by Uzbekistan just prior to the 9/11 incident?
Ukraine, wasn't it? I think it was Ukraine. It was coming from Israel. It might have been going to Uzbekistan, but it was the missile that came up from the ground, came from the Ukraine. They admitted it in the end.
Well, I was just curious about that because I started hearing a little bit more information about this scent gas particular, and this earlier stuff with the Unical trying to pay off the Taliban to get the pipelines coming through there. And it just sort of seemed odd, like, well, maybe this is a reason to create a conflict in this sort of intersection in the world. And then this 9/11 thing happened, and it seemed to sort of get shoved off to the side. I never heard an explanation about that. It seemed very curious.
Back in the Middle Ages, there was a philosopher called William of Ockham, and he was a nominalist, and he was an anti-realist. He said, beings or concepts, that's a better way to translate, are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. In other words, you try to stick with the simplest explanation for things. And everywhere I look, I see the possibility of deep politics, conspiratorial explanations. I try not to follow, I will think about them, I will listen to evidence and so on, but I try not to commit myself to them until there is some kind of overwhelming evidence. And I would say this is a case where I think there have been speculations of the kind that you are saying, not only about that, but just about everything else that's happened in the last 4 months. It's so easy to see everything connected to everything else. But I try to focus on, like the question of Taliban, like you just said, very interesting thing in passing, that UNICAL might have actually given money to the Taliban. That's what the French say. And I'm trying to find out if that's true or not. And I cannot find out. And I've raised this with some Afghan experts who say, oh, that's conspiratorial thinking. I think it's very important to know if these oil companies have their own private intelligence networks that are helping history to happen in a certain way. It's very difficult to do that. But if I focus on that, then I just can't get focused on the Israeli plane. Whereas if I'd been an Israeli who knew somebody on the plane, I'd probably be very focused on it. But I can't help you with that one. I'm trying to, anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? That's you? Okay.
Where did you make your retreat?
Well, the first one was at a place called Land of Medicine Buddha near Soquel, very near Santa Cruz. And the second one I read from was a place called Vajrapani, which is at Boulder Creek, is it, on the peninsula. And the one I didn't get to read was from Spirit Rock, just over the hill almost. Those are where the retreats have been. I think that's just about all. No, it would be Yucca Valley is one of them too, down in the south. Any other questions? I do try to make my poems local in the sense of, you know, I mean, when it's Yucca Valley, I talk a lot about Joshua trees and all that sort of thing.